At 5:14 a.m., the Atlas Command Center on the 43rd floor of Crown Meridian Medical rose over the East River like the bridge of a ship built for people who never expected to touch the water. The glass walls were black with the last of the night. The stone floor had been polished for the launch. 16 live dashboards glowed across a curved wall in jewel tones: emerald bed capacity, amber transport queues, blue transfer requests, red escalation flags, while a catering crew in white gloves arranged breakfast pastries no night shift staff had time to eat. In the middle of all that money and glass and engineered calm, Nora Salazar, 38, overnight throughput coordinator and mother of an 8-year-old girl, was asleep at her desk, not sprawled, not careless. Her cheek rested against her forearm for what could not have been more than a few minutes. Headset still on, one hand near the keyboard. As if her body had simply shut a door her mind had tried to keep open. Beneath her chair sat a dented purple lunchbox with a peeling astronaut sticker and a folded school permission slip tucked under the handle. Her flats were wet from the rain. There was a coffee stain on the cuff of her cardigan. She looked less like part of the room than something the room had failed to hide. Gideon Vale, founder-chairman of the Aurelian Health Network, and one of the men whose name appeared in magazines beside words like visionary and disciplined, stopped walking. The executives behind him stopped too. A consultant smiled before he caught himself. "Whose staff is that?" Gideon asked. No one answered quickly enough. Nora woke at the sound of his voice, lifting her head with the disorientation of someone surfacing from deep water. But her eyes did not go first to the billionaire or the cluster of tailored people around him. They went to the screen above Station 4, to the South Tower ICU row, where 2 negative pressure rooms had just turned green. They should not have been green. The amber isolation banner was missing. "Those rooms are blocked?" she said, still half risen, her voice rough with sleep. "They failed airflow at 2:11. A few people exchanged looks. Gideon glanced at the screen, then back at her lunchbox, her cheap headset, the crease on her sleeve. "If you need to sleep," he said evenly, "you do it at home, not in a command center. Security can disable her badge. Effective now?" The consultant with the expensive watch let out a small breath that sounded too much like relief. Someone at the back laughed once and swallowed it. Nora took off her headset. She did not plead. She did not explain that she had been on her 12th hour because the new bedboard integration had broken twice after midnight, or that her daughter had a pulmonary clinic appointment in 4 hours, or that she had stayed past shift change because no one else in the room seemed to understand why 2 green squares might become 2 dead people. She only reached down for the purple lunchbox, slid a black paper notebook into her tote, and stood. Nobody in that room understood what she had already seen. By the time they realized who she was, the entire hospital system would be failing in public. Nora had never belonged to a workplace that congratulated itself for being mission-driven while spending more on stone and branding than on the people who answered phones at 3 a.m. Crown Meridian was the flagship of Aurelian Health, a network of 9 hospitals and 17 outpatient sites, and the Atlas Command Center had been built to centralize patient flow, transfer intake, discharges, staffing alerts, and the invisible labor of moving the sick through a city with never enough room. The language around it was always cinematic. Mission control, operational excellence, enterprise visibility. The work itself was closer to weather. By the time Nora's shift began at 7 the previous evening, she had already packed Sophia's inhaler, signed a spelling test envelope, argued with her landlord over a banging radiator, and taken the Q train into Manhattan with grapes, discharge worksheets, and the purple lunchbox Sophia refused to replace. The astronaut sticker had been applied crooked at age 5. Since then, the lunchbox had become less an object than proof that some things could stay with you and still be useful. At work, Nora was officially a throughput coordinator. People who did not understand the room called her a scheduler. People higher up called the job administrative. New hires assumed she moved beds on a screen. In reality, she worked at the seam between what the dashboards promised and what the hospital could actually do. A bed did not exist because software called it available. A bed existed because a nurse could staff it. Environmental services had turned it. Supply had stocked it. The previous patient had actually left. The isolation order matched the signage. Transport could move the next body. And somebody on the receiving unit had said yes. Nora trusted mouths more than dashboards. Dashboards forgot that rushed people guessed and tired people lied. She kept a paper grid because paper never mistook a predicted discharge for an actual empty room. That grid was why charge nurses answered her calls on the second ring. Shortly after 2 a.m, the Atlas launch team pushed the final interface update meant to connect the legacy bedboard to the new optimization engine. A young consultant named Bryce, 26, expensive sneakers, perfect beard, no idea what an airborne isolation failure looked like from the hallway outside a patient's room, announced that the sync would take 3 minutes. It took 9. Then the South Tower ICU row flickered. Nora saw it before anyone else because she was comparing the wall against her paper notes from a call with the unit charge nurse at 2:08. Rooms 19A and 19C, both negative pressure, were under engineering hold after an overnight airflow test. They were not clean, not staffed for admission, and definitely not to be used for an immunocompromised transfer from Nassau, who had been waiting on a recorded line since 1:37. On the new dashboard, the rooms turned green. "That mapping is wrong," Nora said. Bryce barely looked up from his laptop. "Probably latency." "It's not latency if the isolation banner disappears. The engine self-corrects on the next cycle." Nora was already dialing South Tower ECU. She got the charge nurse, confirmed the rooms were still blocked, then opened a manual hold in the old system and wrote the time in black ink beside both room numbers. She emailed Renata Cho, the director of patient logistics, copying the shared launch inbox. Subject line, South Tower ICU isolation flags, dropping after patch. At 2:41, she found the same problem in pediatric step-down, where a room under terminal clean pending had been released as available because a discharge order had been entered, but the child was still physically on the floor waiting for respiratory transport. At 3:06, 2 cath lab recovery beds appeared open, even though one nurse had called out sick and staffing had never approved use. Each time, Nora corrected it by hand. She called units directly. She marked her paper grid. She placed manual holds. She noted who answered, who hesitated, which floors sounded too busy to admit. Know which nurses were posturing, which ones were frightened. The room around her trusted the wall of color. Nora trusted the catch in a charge nurse's breath when she said, "Technically, we can take one, but I don't have a monitor tech after 4. This was the part outsiders never understood. Hospitals did not fail in dramatic movie ways. They failed by accumulating small falsehoods until the wrong patient arrived at the wrong door, and nobody could move fast enough to correct the lie. Theo Kim understood maybe 10% of this, which was more than most people in the Atlas room. Theo was 24, newly hired into capacity analytics after a fellowship in health administration, with the caution of someone smart enough to know he was young. He sat 2 stations down from Nora and had learned that every serious problem bent toward her. If a septic transfer, a dirty room dispute, or a pediatric ICU hold needed a real answer, Nora had it. The room ran on software until it didn't. Then it ran on Nora. She rarely raised her voice. She almost never used jargon for show. She wrote everything down. Around 4, Theo watched her peel the lid off a yogurt she never got to finish while answering 3 lines at once. A transfer request from a community hospital in Queens, a staffing question from Float Pool, and a transport complaint about a ventilator lift team delayed in the freight elevator. On her desk, beside the keyboard, lay the black notebook and a child's permission slip for the Bronx Zoo, the bottom line unsigned. "You should tell Renata to pause the go-live," Theo said quietly after the second bad sync. Nora looked at the screen without looking away from her call. "I did. And people confuse expensive with ready." At 4:47, the East Tower step-down census rolled over and briefly showed 4 beds available that did not exist because 2 were blocked for a plumbing leak and 2 more required telemetry staff the night supervisor did not have. Nora corrected that one too. She sent another email. She left a voicemail on Renata's line. She updated a yellow legal pad titled, "Downtime if Atlas Fails." Then, at some point after 12.5 hours of manually holding together a launch designed by people who could leave at noon and call it transformation, Nora's body made its decision without consulting her. The thing about humiliation, she had learned, was that it rarely arrived hot. Sometimes it came so cold, it left no visible bruise. In the elevator down from the 43rd floor, with her badge already dead against her chest, Nora stood between a pastry cart and a transport orderly and watched the polished numbers descend. Her reflection in the mirrored wall looked older than 38. Not dramatically older. Just worn at the edges in ways money usually prevented. She thought of calling Renata, then decided against it. She had sent 3 emails and left a voicemail. If a director needed a billionaire to tell her who mattered on a night launch, she was not going to discover courage at 5:25 in the morning. The transport orderly glanced at Nora's disabled badge and then away. New York was full of people who knew how not to witness things. Outside, dawn was gray. Nora crossed First Avenue in air that smelled of diesel and bakery steam. Then called the after-school office to confirm Sophia could stay until 6 if the conference ran late. She said nothing about being fired, rent due in 10 days, or the inhaler refill waiting for a copay she had planned to cover with Friday's differential. "Thank you," she told the school secretary in the voice she used whenever money was about to become a problem. "I appreciate it." Then she took the subway home to Jackson Heights with her black notebook on her lap and the purple lunchbox held upright so the grapes inside would not bruise. By 6:10, the Atlas launch room had decided that Nora's concerns were a temperament issue. Renata arrived in a cream silk blouse at 6:02, read the first email on her phone while walking, and said, if she opened manual holds, just clear them. The point of today is to trust the integrated view. Bryce nodded, as if this were a technical answer. Theo stared at his keyboard. At 6:18, Gideon Vale entered the board breakfast on the mezzanine above the command center and gave a short speech about precision, scale, and how modern institutions suffered when legacy habits were allowed to survive under the banner of caution. Through the glass, reporters from a healthcare trade publication filmed beauty shots of the screens. At 6:26, the transfer center accepted a non-emergent cardiac step-down patient from Long Island because Atlas showed East Tower capacity at +4. At 6:39, another coordinator accepted a neurology transfer from Yonkers after seeing 2 ICU beds green in the South Tower. At 7:05, Environmental Services reported that one of those South Tower rooms was still sealed for engineering. The alert went into a queue no one in the Atlas room was actively watching because the new workflow assigned those exceptions to a filtered panel Nora had usually monitored herself. At 7:12, pediatric step-down called, asking why transport was bringing them a child into a room still under terminal clean. At 7:19, the cath lab recovery charge nurse informed the command center that she had 1 fewer nurse than planned and could not safely open the second bay Atlas had already counted. Each problem by itself seemed manageable. That was the danger. Theo opened Nora's last email again. The subject lines were not dramatic. They were specific. ICU isolation flags, dropping after patch. PED step-down room released before turn. The staffed bed, not equal to physical bed. At 7:24, he clicked the old system and found her manual holds had indeed been cleared. "Renata," he said, trying to keep his voice neutral. "The false capacity is spreading to transfer intake." She did not look up from her phone. "Then use the enterprise view, Theo. That's why we built it." "But the enterprise view is what's wrong." Bryce turned in his chair. "The model predicts corrected availability once discharges process. You're seeing temporary mismatch." "A mismatch is not temporary if a patient is already in an ambulance," Theo said. That made the room quieter for half a second. Renata finally looked up. "If you're escalating, escalate through me. Do not create noise on launch morning." Noise. Theo would remember that word later. Because it was what powerful people called information they did not want to fit. By 8:03, the first ambulance had arrived with the cardiac step-down patient, only to discover the assigned bed still occupied by a woman waiting for transport to rehab. The patient was boarded in the emergency department hallway with a telemetry monitor balanced on a rolling pole and a nurse borrowed from another unit. At 8:17, the neurology transfer from Yonkers was still 20 minutes out, and South Tower, ICU, now had 0 usable negative pressure rooms. Infection control began calling. So did respiratory. At 8:28, because Atlas had overpromised step-down capacity, the operating room charge nurse delayed 2 elective cases that required post-op monitored beds. One of the patients was a donor-adjacent hedge fund manager who knew Gideon Vale socially. The complaint traveled faster than any safety concern had. At 8:41, the emergency department reached 66 boarded patients. At 8:52, Dr. Lena Patt, the chief medical officer for Crown Meridian, walked into the command center still wearing the same navy suit she had worn since before dawn, looked at the wall, and said, "Why do I have accepted transfers with no staffed beds?" Nobody answered well. Lena Patt had the hard, economical stillness of a physician who no longer wasted energy pretending not to see incompetence. She was not beloved exactly, but she was trusted by people who cared more about reality than charm. Nora liked her for that reason, though they had never spoken more than a handful of times. "We're seeing launch instability," Renata said. "Instability?" Lena repeated. "My ED is in gridlock and somebody assigned a neutropenic patient to a room under airflow hold. That's not instability. That's unsafe." Theo swallowed. Nora flagged the mapping issue at 2:11. Lena turned. "Nora who?" Silence again. Bryce answered first. "The overnight coordinator who was removed this morning for sleeping at her station." Something in Lena's face changed, not dramatically, but enough. "Removed by whom?" No one wanted to say Gideon's name in the wrong tone. By 9:06, Atlas was no longer a launch problem. It was a system event. The old lies bred new ones. Atlas counted predicted discharges as usable beds, scrubbed isolation holds, and showed physical rooms instead of nurse-supported rooms. The difference, in a hospital, between a place and a fantasy. Transport teams idled in corridors. Bed assignments were revised, rescinded, reassigned, then lost. The transfer center's recorded lines stacked call over call. An outside hospital with a septic dialysis patient, a suburban emergency department with a pediatric asthma case needing higher-level respiratory support, a community neurologist begging for a stroke bed before thrombolytic windows closed, a postpartum hemorrhage at an affiliate site waiting for an ICU slot. The more the room trusted the wall, the worse the wall became. At 9:22, Crown Meridian went on internal diversion for all non-essential direct admits. At 9:31, State Regional Capacity Coordination called asking whether Aurelian was actually able to honor the transfer numbers it had posted. At 9:44, a photo from the mezzanine breakfast hit social media, showing Gideon Vale smiling below the words, "Real-time care. Real-time confidence." While 3 floors beneath that image, nurses were holding admitted patients in hallways because no one could tell which beds were real. Theo found Nora's yellow legal pad in a drawer she had forgotten to lock. Across the top, in all caps, she had written, "If Atlas counts discharge orders as empty beds, freeze non-EMTALA transfers immediately. Verify staffed capacity by unit, not dashboard. Call charge nurse, then EVS, then house supervisor." Below that were extension numbers, names, times, tiny notes in the margin. PICU protects vent after October 15th. South ICU 19, AHVAC retest 1000. Cath recovery unsafe at 1 RN short. Theo brought the pad to Lena. She read 2 lines and said, "Where is she?" Nobody knew. Nora was in the second row folding chair of room 203 at PS 148 when Theo called. The classroom smelled like dry erase markers, pencil shavings, and the faint, sugary warmth of morning snack. Sophia's teacher was talking gently about reading fluency and how bright Sophia was when she felt settled. Nora sat with the conference packet in her lap and tried to listen as if the ground under the rest of her life had not shifted at dawn. She had not told the teacher she no longer had a job. She had not told Sophia either. Sophia was down the hall in art, making paper lanterns for an international night Nora was supposed to volunteer at next month if she could swap shifts. Her phone buzzed once, then again. When Nora saw Theo's name, her first feeling was not anger, it was certainty. She stepped into the hallway before answering. Student artwork covered the cinderblock walls in crooked rows of watercolor borough skylines and self-portraits with eyelashes like fireworks. "Nora!" Theo said too quickly. Behind him, she could hear layered voices, alarms, phones, the throb of a room that had lost shape. "Lena Pat needs you. The dashboard's releasing blocked and predicted beds. Transfer intake is still live. South Tower ICU is full. Pediatric step-down took a room before terminal clean. We're on diversion and regional capacity is calling." Nora closed her eyes. "Did they kill the discharge auto-release feed?" "I don't know." "Did anyone freeze non-EMTALA?" "No," Renata said. I know what Renata said. At the other end of the hall, Sophia came out of art with blue paint on 2 fingers and stopped when she saw her mother's face. Nora lowered her voice. "How bad?" Theo hesitated. That frightened her more than panic would have. "There's a 6-year-old on transfer hold from New Rochelle with status asthmaticus," he said. "PED's critical care says we may lose the bed if we can't verify staffed capacity in 10 minutes. For a moment, Nora was no longer in the school hallway. She was 8 years back in another hospital, standing over a warmer, while Sophia, born at 29 weeks with lungs too thin for the world, pulled against a ventilator tube the width of a straw. She remembered a resident saying there was a delay because the receiving unit had listed a bed that wasn't actually staffed yet. She remembered the silence after that sentence, the terrible bureaucratic politeness with which people described danger when it happened to someone else's child. "Put Dr. Pot on," Nora said. Lena came on without preamble. "Can you fix it?" Nora looked through the doorway at Sophia, who had started rubbing the blue paint between her fingers because children always touched uncertainty, as if it might become texture. "Yes," Nora said. "If people stop performing and start listening. Come in. I'll clear security." "I'm with my daughter." Lena was quiet for 1 beat. "Bring her. We'll make a room." Nora almost said no out of habit. Single mothers learned early that institutions offered accommodation in voices that implied inconvenience. But this was not about convenience now. When she turned, Sophia was already beside her. Is it work? Sophia asked. Nora nodded. Bad work? Important work. Sophia considered this, then held up the conference packet and the paper lantern she had made from folded blue construction paper. Can I bring this? Yes, Nora said. Bring everything. At 10:18, when Nora stepped back into Crown Meridian with Sophia's hand in hers and the purple lunchbox swinging from her tote, the command center no longer looked expensive. It looked frightened. The wall of screens had gone from jewel tones to fever colors. Red escalation flags pulsed in 3 columns. The transfer queue had doubled. People were standing instead of sitting, which in operations rooms was equivalent to smoke. Security at the elevator bank saw Nora's dead badge and began to object. Then Lena Bott appeared herself, took one look at the guard, and said, "She's with me." That was the first reversal. The second happened inside the room. No one announced Nora. No one apologized. Gideon Vale stood near the central table with his jacket off and his expression honed into something tighter than embarrassment. Renata looked pale. Bryce had 2 laptops open and the brittle stillness of a man discovering that systems could bleed. Nora did not look at any of them for more than a second. She set Sophia in the glass huddle room behind Station 2 with a juice box from catering and Theo's spare phone charger, gave her the lunchbox and the conference packet, and told her, "Stay where I can see you. If you need me, knock on the glass." Sophia nodded with solemnity beyond 8. Then Nora walked to the central table, opened her black notebook, and began. "Freeze all non-EMTALA inbound transfers now," she said. "Not review. Freeze. If it isn't stroke, STEMI, trauma, active labor, or unstable pediatric critical care, it waits. Theo, pull accepted but not arrived by service line. Bryce, kill the discharge auto-release feed and stop counting predicted beds as live capacity. Renata, I need every house supervisor and every ICU, step down, and PACU charge nurse on a bridge line in 5 minutes. Environmental services too. Not directors. Working leads." No one moved for half a second because status had memory. Lena broke it. "Do it!" Everything after that happened fast. Nora redrew the hospital on paper before the software could lie again. Physical beds in 1 column. Staffed beds in another. Isolation-safe rooms marked red. Flex spaces circled blue. Transfer back candidates arrowed out. She called each unit the same way. What's empty? What's staffed? What's dirty? What's blocked? What needs respiratory? What can move? What are you protecting for the next 4 hours? People answered her because the room had moved beyond rank into necessity. The route failure emerged within 12 minutes. Atlas was mapping discharge orders to provisional availability and collapsing 3 distinct statuses, terminal clean pending, blocked, and available with request, into 1 green category whenever a downstream transfer demand existed. The dashboard had been optimized to reduce perceived idle capacity. In practice, it was laundering uncertainty into certainty. "Who approved that logic?" Lena asked. Bryce said nothing. Gideon did not speak either. Nora was already elsewhere. "South Tower ICU has 0 negative pressure beds. Mark it 0. PED step-down has 1 room after EVS turns 14B and respiratory clears tubing stock. PACU can absorb 2 monitored post-ops for 90 minutes if anesthesia signs off. Transfer back the stable post-cath from Nassau after procedure. Hold the Yonkers neuro case unless stroke severity upgrades. Give the 6-year-old asthma transfer the first verified PED's critical slot. Not the board slot. The verified one." Theo typed as fast as he could. Every instruction she gave was both specific and strangely generous, as if she were teaching the room how to think while also saving it from itself. At 10:47, the first bridge call connected all tower supervisors, transport control, EVS leads, and transfer intake. The noise was brutal. Nora cut through it with the quietest voice in the room. "Nobody uses Atlas numbers until I say so," she said. "If a bed is not confirmed by unit and support service, it doesn't exist. We are on manual capacity protocol effective now. Say yes if you understand." A chain of yeses moved through the line. Tired, irritated, relieved. That was the real system. Not the wall, the people. At 11:03, they gave the asthmatic child a verified pediatric critical bed after confirming staffing, respiratory setup, and transport. At 11:08, they stopped a septic dialysis transfer from rolling into an occupied room. At 11:14, Nora opened 3 step-down beds the software had missed. At 11:21, she transfer-backed 2 stable post-procedure patients and freed monitored space. By 11:34, ED boarding finally flattened. By 11:52, the wall was no longer running the hospital. Nora was. Silence came strangely after that, not all at once, but in gaps. Phones still rang. The bridge line still pulsed with updates. Transport still argued about elevators, and central supply still misplaced tubing, and nobody in emergency medicine believed a crisis was over until they had survived it twice. But the command center itself changed temperature. The loud certainty that had filled it at dawn was gone. In its place was the colder, more useful humility of people who had watched a room outrank its own dashboards. Theo looked up from his station and saw Gideon Vale standing a few feet from Nora, with the expression of a man who had spent a career confusing visibility with value and had just discovered the accounting error at the center of his own institution. Nora had not eaten. The pastries remained mostly untouched on the side credenza, lacquered fruit drying under conference room lights. In the glass huddle room, Sophia sat cross-legged on a chair, coloring quietly on the back of the conference packet, glancing up every so often to make sure her mother was still there. At 12:07, when the last pending pediatric transfer was safely assigned and the diversion status narrowed instead of widened, Lena Bat stepped away from the bridge call and exhaled through her nose. "All right," she said. "We can breathe for 30 seconds. No one believed her, but several people obeyed. That was when Gideon crossed the remaining distance. Up close, he looked older than he had at dawn, or perhaps merely more expensive in a way that no longer helped him. He had the kind of face built from self-command, which meant shock showed on it as offense before it became comprehension. "Ms. Salazar?" he said. Nora kept writing. "It's Nora." He nodded once. "Nora, I made a decision this morning without understanding your role." She did not rescue him from the sentence. Around them, no one pretended not to hear. "You did?" she said. There was no heat in it. That made it land harder. Gideon glanced at the black notebook, the paper grid, the bridge line still live, the wall he had spent millions building, and the woman he had removed from it before sunrise. "Lena tells me you built the downtime protocol," he said. "The first version, during the winter surge 3 years ago? Why are you in this position?" It was the wrong question, but it revealed something useful. He had reached the edge of his own categories. People like Nora were supposed to be administrative until they were not. If they were this essential, someone important would have named them important already. The fact that no one had was the part he could not quickly reconcile. Nora finally looked at him fully. "Because this shift lets me get my daughter to school," she said. That was all. Not the whole answer, but enough to expose the shame in the room. The deeper truth came to them in fragments over the next hour, mostly because Theo, running bridge lines and printouts, began to see the outlines of a life that rank had hidden. He learned from Lena that Nora had once been a pediatric ICU nurse before moving into throughput. He learned from an old binder that she had written half the manual capacity procedures now rescuing Atlas. He learned from respiratory that Sophia had spent 73 days in neonatal intensive care. And Nora had never again trusted a bed to be real until a human being proved it. The rest he understood by observation. The lunchbox. The school conference packet. The way Nora checked the glass room between calls. The way she never wasted a sentence on ego because mothers who worked nights did not have spare language for performance. The way she carried the whole network, not like a savior, but like someone used to carrying too much without witness. At 12:46, Renata approached Nora with a face arranged into professional remorse. "I should have escalated your emails," she said. Nora was marking transfer back times. "Yes." Renata waited for more and got none. Apologies, Nora had found, were often requests in disguise. "Please help me restore my own image of myself." She did not have time for that. Not with Sophia's school dismissal in 3 hours, and payroll suddenly uncertain, and the 6-year-old asthma transfer only just arrived upstairs. At 1:02, the reporter from the mezzanine asked whether the launch event would resume. Lena said no. At 1:11, Gideon ordered the Atlas optimization feed shut down across all 9 Aurelian hospitals pending independent review. At 1:19, he pulled every executive director into a conference room and closed the glass walls. Through them, Theo watched him listen more than speak. It was probably the first useful thing he had done all day. Nora stayed at the command table until 1:38, long enough to stabilize the manual census, long enough to establish a 3-hour verification cycle, long enough to assign Theo ownership of the exception panel, and force Bryce to document every status field Atlas had collapsed under its pretty green lies. Only then did she go into the huddle room. Sophia had built a tiny paper hospital out of the conference packet, folding corners into roofs and using paper clips as people. "Are they still in trouble?" she asked. Nora smiled despite herself. "Less than before." "Did you fix it?" Nora looked through the glass at the adults still moving with newly careful bodies. "I helped them stop making it worse," she said. Sophia seemed to find that answer sufficient. Children often respected precision more than grown people did. When Nora came back out with her tote on one shoulder and the lunchbox in hand, Gideon was waiting near the elevator bank. He did not try to block her path. To his credit, he had learned something, even if not enough. "HR will reverse the termination," he said. "And I'd like to discuss a role with broader authority, reporting structure, compensation, whatever resources are necessary." The offer was real. So was the timing. Nora shifted the lunchbox so it would not slip. "You should discuss broader authority for the night supervisors, the transfer intake nurses, the EVS leads, and anyone else whose work only becomes visible when executives break it," she said. "If you build another room like this, start with the people who know where the lies enter." Gideon held her gaze. For a moment, Theo thought he might defend himself again out of reflex. Instead, he said, quietly, "Understood." It was not absolution. It was merely accurate. On the ride down, Sophia leaned against Nora's side and asked for the grapes from the lunchbox. Nora opened it carefully. Inside, beneath the container and the crumpled napkin, lay the folded permission slip and a note in Sophia's slanted handwriting that Nora had forgotten to read that morning. It said, "For when you get tired, or remember you know everything." Nora looked at the note long enough that Sophia noticed. "I meant at work," Sophia said, suddenly shy. "I know." The laugh that came out of Nora was soft and brief and almost private, as if her body was relearning some smaller use for breath than endurance. Outside the hospital, the afternoon had turned clear. The city looked exactly the same, which was one of its harshest qualities. Taxis still honked. Delivery bikes still cut lights. Someone sold mango slices on the corner. A billionaire's humiliation did nothing to the weather. Nora took Sophia downtown on the train because the child had missed half a school day and deserved the small extravagance of the window seat. Sophia ate grapes and talked about her paper lantern, her spelling word, and the girl who never returned pencils. Nora listened and did not mention Gideon's offer. By the time they reached Jackson Heights, the first formal voicemail had already arrived from Human Resources, followed by one from Lena, then another from a number Nora did not know that was almost certainly Gideon's office. She silenced all three. In the apartment, the radiator was still knocking. The sink held 2 breakfast bowls and a mug with a hairline crack. Nothing in the kitchen reflected a morning in which a 9-hospital network had nearly been brought down by arrogance, fatigue, and a software model built to flatter executives. Sophia spread her homework on the table. On the counter, beside the stove, sat the paper lantern Sophia had carried back from school, its blue folds imperfect and stubbornly upright. When the evening draft from the rattling radiator touched it, the lantern trembled but held its shape. Nora noticed that, the way she noticed everything that mattered, not as symbolism, not as comfort, only as another small structure surviving strain, because someone had made it carefully enough to last through one more night. Nora rinsed the grapes, signed the zoo slip, set water to boil, and moved through the kitchen with the same competence she had used under the command center screens, except here, nobody mistook it for strategy. At 6:42, while Sophia sounded out a reading passage about owls, Nora finally played Lena's voicemail. It was brief. "Take tomorrow," the chief medical officer said. "Then come see me, not HR, me." Nora deleted nothing. She set the phone face down beside the stove. Later, after dinner, and after inhaler and spelling words, and the argument over whether pajamas counted as clean if they had only been worn once, Sophia fell asleep on the couch with one sock half off and a library book open on her chest. Nora lifted her gently, settled her in bed, and stood for a moment in the doorway watching the slow, reliable rise of her back. Then she returned to the kitchen. The purple lunchbox sat on the counter under the yellow light, scuffed and still useful. Nora washed it by hand, dried the inside, smoothed Sophia's note, and tucked it into the front pocket instead of throwing it away. On the table beside the lunchbox, her disabled badge lay next to the black notebook and the unsigned future of the next day. Nora opened the refrigerator, took out sliced apples, and began packing lunch for the morning. She had not become valuable when they finally noticed. She had only become visible.